Hi, everyone, and welcome to the lesson on gender for Introduction to Sociology. Let's start off with a photo analysis. This is a picture of a little girl, and we can ask ourselves, what clues let us know the gender of this little girl? It seems their parents worked really hard at making this little girl look like a little girl. So you may be thinking the long curly hair kind of gives it away, or the dress, or maybe the frilly hat, or the shoes, or maybe even the way that the child is posed. It may surprise you to find out that this quote-unquote little girl is actually Teddy Roosevelt, a former U.S. president. Teddy Roosevelt in this photo was about 2 years old at the time, and during the time that this photo was taken, this was an absolutely normal way of dressing a little boy. Dresses and the rest of the attire that Teddy Roosevelt has on was considered gender neutral for infants and for young children. This teaches us that gender, like other things in our culture, are socially constructed. What we mean by the fact that gender is socially constructed is just that gender is socially constructed when its meaning and symbolism is based on society's changing perception of the concept. So as society changes, you're going to see a change in meaning and symbolism attached to what is considered masculine and what is considered feminine. Not only have norms regarding the appearance and attire appropriate for boys and girls changed over time, but norms for behavior among men have also changed over time as well. So at one point it was perfectly acceptable for men to touch closely as long as the two were close friends. So these two gentlemen are posing the way two friends would pose at the time. Here are a few more examples. Some very warm embraces of some very close friends. Now, in today's homophobic society, many people would assume that there is something homosexual or homoerotic about the photos in some way. But at the time, this was just the way that gender was constructed. It was perfectly acceptable for these men to touch. The meaning associated with masculinity allowed for this. And the symbolism attached to masculinity allowed for this close touching without any insinuation of their sexuality. Here are a couple of more modern examples of how gender can be socially constructed in different ways. In many Arab and Middle Eastern countries, they don't have these uptight rules about touching and kissing of other men. Many Arab and Middle Eastern men greet each other by kissing each other on the cheek. If you're close friends with somebody, it's perfectly acceptable to hold hands or embrace each other as you walk down the street. People even sit on each other's laps as a way to demonstrate friendship and closeness. So this teaches us that not only do the gender norms of a society change over time, but they also vary across cultures. And like I mentioned, there are many societies and many cultures, not just Arab and Middle Eastern, where men are allowed to embrace each other, to hold hands, to kiss each other on the cheek when they greet, those kinds of things. In conclusion, when it comes to the social construction of gender, is that gender norms, the norms related to what is considered masculine and what is considered feminine, are ever changing and are just one of many examples of how gender is something that is socially constructed. Another way that gender is socially constructed is through an ideology. Every great concept needs an ideology attached to it, which are a set of beliefs about that concept. So gender has an ideology, and that ideology, the dominant ideology in our society, is the gender binary. The gender binary is this idea that gender only includes two distinct categories. There's men and then there's women. And we essentialize men and women when we make statements like, oh, you can be such a girl sometime, or she's a tomboy, or he's a really good listener for a guy. When we use these stereotypes in such a fashion, we're looking at the world through gender binary glasses. It's perfectly natural to see the world in this way because this is how we have been socialized. So successful socialization kind of instills in us the gender binary. However, this can sometimes have some unwanted effects in society, which we'll talk about later. Before that, though, we have to understand what is sex and what is gender. And so those are the questions we'll want to consider, as well as what are the differences between the two. When it comes to sex, it includes your sexual reproductive organs, the hormones produced in male and female bodies, the various processes that happen at maturation of males and female bodies, including things like body hair, breasts, hips, height, muscle mass, those kinds of things. When we say male and female, we are referring to sex. We can also refer to the body when we're talking about sex, so we can say female bodies or male bodies. Sex refers to the body and doesn't necessarily extend to how a person feels or acts or is perceived by other people in society. That's where gender comes in. Gender is the symbolism associated with masculinity and femininity and other gender types. Gender is also something that requires us to exaggerate the gender binary for us to bring it into existence. Without our active involvement in enacting the gender binary, gender would cease to exist as we know it. The gender ideology would fall apart. So it takes our active involvement to do this. So, for example, in a gym, you will see men working on their muscles to exaggerate the male body's increase of mass compared to the female body. Meanwhile, females tend to stick to more aerobic exercises that allow for the slimming of the body, again exaggerating the difference between males and females. In reality, males and female bodies, biologically speaking, are more similar than not similar, than different. A lot of our hormones levels overlap, a lot of our heights overlap, muscle mass even overlaps. If we didn't pay attention to the gender binary, males and females would look very, very similar to one another. So why is it that we so actively engage in the gender binary? Why is it that we distinguish so distinctly between males and females, between men and women? Do the differences reflect a biological reality, or are they exaggerated through differences? From a functionalist perspective, they say that men and women's roles complement each other, and that's why we enact the gender binary. It's argued that men are instrumental. They play the task-oriented, leadership, practical, and achieving role, while women are more the supportive role. They're expressive, they're emotion-oriented, and they are caretakers. From a feminist and / conflict theory, we're going to look at institutions and how they're shaped by power, how they're shaped by those with influence. Institutions that are shaped by those with power and influence are going to reflect the interest and the values of those who have power and influence. So our institutions are automatically set up to systematically benefit those who generally conform to gender norms. Since gender norms and the gender ideology that we live in has been shaped by those with power and influence, our institutions are also going to reflect those gender norms. Even as society's gender norms change, our culture is constantly changing. A dominant gender ideology always ensures that androcentrism, which we'll talk about, and subordination, which we'll talk about, survives any societal transformation. So for conflict theorists and feminist theorists, the answer to why we enact the gender binary, it has to do with power, the necessary steps to maintain that power in society. And so one of the explanations provided by conflict theorists and / feminist theorists is that sexism allows for this type of inequality to persist, right? This gender binary to exist. So sexism is prejudice based on someone's biological sex. This is the fact in society that male bodies are preferred, valued higher, and privileged over female bodies. For example, hundreds of surveys and experiments have demonstrated that males are seen as more natural leaders, better at math, and just generally more competent. This is how people value males compared to females, despite there not being evidence that males are any better leaders than females, that that there's no evidence that females can't be just as good at math, etc. But the way that sexism works is not on facts, but on beliefs. Androcentrism is gender-based prejudice. So whereas sexism refers to the body, androcentrism refers to gender norms. Androcentrism means in our society that masculine traits are valued over feminine traits. Rewards are based on acting masculine. You can see females acting like tomboys and receive some rewards and acceptance for the most part, but males for the most part are not supposed to act feminine. They do not receive the same awards and benefits. Lastly, conflict theorists and feminist theorists talk about subordination. Subordination is a relationship where one position is subservient or dependent on another. The final step in the way that our gender binary system operates is for female bodies to enact femininity and then enter positions that are subservient to men. So for example, nursing is a female-dominated field, and they tend to play these more supportive roles in the health fields, and they tend to play more of the subservient role to the doctor, and doctors have historically been a male-dominated sphere. So with that said, that wraps up our lesson on gender. We talked about several concepts, including the functionalist and conflict theorist approach to gender. We talked about the difference between sex and gender. And then we also talked about the social construction of gender.